This panel needs very little introduction. Across the country in Justice Reinvestment states, Department of Corrections commissioners and directors and secretaries have played a leading role in helping state working groups understand their sentencing and corrections system, developing policy options, and then implementing the reforms. And that's what we're here to talk about. Turn it over to Mike Thompson from the Council State Government's Justice Center.
Great. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Testing. How about now? No? All right, there we go. Hi, Mike Thompson from the Council State Government's Justice Center. We met earlier. Thrilled to lead this particular session. Jake referenced earlier that we've heard the word partnership now dozens of times, and it starts to lose its meaning. But one thing I do want to underscore is if there was ever evidence of the partnership that we have here today between the public and private Pew Charitable Trusts and the Department of Justice, just look in front of you, that creme brulee, that chicken waffle that you had last night, right? The federal government did not pay for any of that, I assure you. If this was only funded by the federal government, we'd all be in a line outside a taco truck right now, reimbursing each other for lunch. So thank you very much, Pew, for these lovely meals. We're extremely grateful to you. I hope you'll bear with me as I kick off this panel. I want to just share with you a quick story, which I actually believe bears some relationship to the themes that we're going to talk about right now. In late August, kids receive assignments in New Jersey as to who their homeroom teacher is going to be in school. It's news awaited with considerable anticipation. Everybody gets very excited about this kinds of news. And it was not long ago that my son was waiting for news as to his homeroom teacher was going to be. And we got the news, and I came over. I said, well, we found out who your homeroom teacher is. And he stood there with fists clenched, and he said, who is it? I said, it's Ms. McClellan. Yes, he says. He pumps his fist. I said, okay, that's good. He goes, yeah, it's great. He said, she's the oldest teacher, and she's been there longer than anybody else at Washington Elementary. So this is fantastic. I said, is it her wisdom? You know, is it sort of all of her experience that'll be incredibly helpful? No, everybody at Washington Elementary knows that the oldest teacher with the most experience gets the air-conditioned classroom at Washington Elementary. Of course, right? Why hadn't I sort of known this tidbit? So I get fascinated by sort of how all these kinds of things happen, right? The sort of political beast in me. So I go to back to school night, and I'm watching a couple of parents of other fifth grade kids who are not in my son's classroom having an animated conversation with the principal, pointing their finger, you know, and sort of slide over so I can hear a little more about what's going on. It's about the air-conditioned classroom, right? Why isn't my kid in the air-conditioned classroom, and why are we paying money for that class to have the air conditioning? And I see, you know, our Dr. Principal, and he says, you know, I want to assure you there's a rule that's being put in place to deal with this, and district-wide policy. My son calls it the district law. The district law is that the air conditioning cannot go on unless the temperature exceeds 90 degrees, by which time it's become so painful that everyone thinks, okay, now we can finally turn on the air conditioning in that one classroom that has it. So not too long ago, on an abnormally warm September day, I see my son grab his sweatshirt as he's racing off to school. What are you doing grabbing your sweatshirt? He said, well, it gets cold in Ms. McClellan's room with all that air conditioning blowing on me in there. And I said, oh, no. I know about the law that you talked about, and I checked the weather forecast, and it ain't supposed to get above 85 degrees. And he said, oh, Ms. McClellan's got a system for this. I said, yeah, what's the system? He said, she's got a step ladder. I got a heating pad. We wave it in front of the air conditioner thing, and it triggers it, and there we go. I tell you that story because no matter what law gets passed, if people don't want to really believe in it, they will think of a way to find some kind of end run to do whatever it is that they always wanted to do, right? And nobody knows that better than all the people who are gathered in this room here. And certainly the very seasoned corrections leaders we have, this is something they're immensely familiar with. And so this is a discussion that I've been asked to facilitate. And I do want to note that the corrections professionals around me have a combined 30-plus years as directors of their state systems. you know, though, the average tenure of a corrections director, typically when you look at it, is just around 2 years. So God forbid anything happened to these people here on this podium, you will see the tenure probably cut down to a couple months across the country. This is some of our most experienced directors, and I'm thrilled to have you as part of this discussion. Let me introduce them quickly. Their biographies are in the materials you have. A.T. Wall is the Director of Corrections in the Department of Rhode Island, served many governors. He's the past president of the Association of the State Correctional Administrators. David Guice, a career corrections professional, community corrections, but also an elected official, state legislator, now the Commissioner of the Department of Corrections and Juvenile Justice in the state of North Carolina. Colette Peters from the state of Oregon, the head of corrections there, also with experience running the state juvenile system, and before that, even more experience working in adult corrections. Commissioner LaDonna Thompson from Kentucky, where she's been the commissioner there for 7.5 years, leading that great state's correction system. So please give me a warm welcome to the panelists that we have here. So as you know, we're going to talk now about bills that have already been signed into law, and typically your agencies play a key role with actually now translating these high-level visions into very concrete, everyday policy and practice. I'm going to ask some questions, and I hope you'll forgive my interruptions in advance. We don't have too much time, and there's a lot of stuff that we want to cover. The first thing I want to talk to is each of you played an instrumental role in going back and forth with the governor, the legislative leaders, key constituents about the policy, the ideas that ultimately became law in justice reinvestment legislation. There came a point in time, though, where after the bill signing ceremony was over, you turned to your senior management team and said, okay, this is what we got to do. And I want to ask you a little bit about what that moment was like and what advice you may have for other people in that particular situation. And Commissioner Guice, I'd love to start with you. Walk us through a little bit about sort of that moment when you were over at the Department of Corrections and were trying to explain to people the law that you'd actually been involved in actually getting passed.
Well, it was quite exciting because we had passed the legislation, and a short time later the governor asked me to come back to work. I had retired and asked me to come back to work to help with the implementation of justice reinvestment. And I recall the conversations that I had with management folks throughout the department as we were moving the legislation. And they assured me that we could get this done within the time frame of when the law was going to be enacted. And all of a sudden, I'm sitting in the chair of Director of Community Corrections, and I realize, oh my God. As I talked to our staff really throughout the field and throughout the organization, I realized we had to get a lot of things in place very quickly to meet the deadlines. One thing I will tell you that I went back and said to some of those management folks, you should have told me it was going to take longer. Well, they were embracing my drive and desire to move that legislation and to move it through the House and Senate. But believe me, getting the law passed was fairly easy compared to implementation. That was very difficult. And you have to have the buy-in from the organization. The sooner you can get that buy-in early in the process, I would recommend that.
Thanks, Commissioner. Director Peters, I know it wasn't too long ago that you just had legislation signed into law in Oregon. Can you tell us a little bit about the conversations that are happening now between you and your senior management team as you look to translate these ideas now into everyday policy and practice?
Sure. Well, it was definitely a big push to get the legislation passed. So we felt like once that had been completed, there would be a resting period, and there was not. So I think we quickly realized that the work was really beginning at that point in time. So we actually assigned specific staff inside the agency to really monitor the conversations that were continuing between stakeholders, because those conversations and the policies were continuing to develop. But it really tied into the work that we were already doing at the agency. As we're turning our agencies into outcome-based organizations, this work really tied into that. And so it was a conversation that worked well in our quarterly target reviews as we looked at managing the outcomes of this legislation and pushing the policies forward.
Commissioner, just back to you for a minute. Director Peters is saying she designated a lead person. You do the same in your agency. Is there sort of a lead person you designated, and did it become that person's exclusive job to oversee the implementation?
Yes, sir. That was extremely important. In fact, he is here today, and I appreciate the leadership that he has provided. But we needed to designate someone that would be able to monitor and watch and as I say, be the person out in the field communicating with the DAs and the judges and moving around the state and doing the great work. But we did need to dedicate someone for that purposes. And it was also important for us to look at how we were going to implement that big piece of legislation. And we actually put together groups of folks that helped us focus on making sure that we would be successful. Training, training, training. The legislation that we passed actually changed how we do business at the courthouse all across North Carolina. So in 100 counties, we had to train judges, DAs, clerks, probation staff, sheriffs. And so we built a strong group of folks to assist us in delivering that message. But we did dedicate and still have that person in that place, and will be something we'll always have.
Commissioner Thompson, in Kentucky, the legislation that was passed there really was quite comprehensive in terms of all the different aspects of the system that it involved. Tell us a little bit about the conversations that occurred with your team and advice you have for folks in the state.
Well, ours is a little bit of a combo because, like Colette said, we had already seen and had the challenge within the department about the growing numbers, and we had previously had some grant monies to do a reentry conference, which brought some of our key staff in, and also community leaders even prior to the legislation passing. And as we worked through the legislation, there were pieces we knew were going to come. So we had already planned for that, and we did what David did. We put together groups of folks who were responsible for specific areas with specific deadline dates, and then I actually met with them every couple of weeks to see. Sometimes we were our own worst enemy. You know, where was the challenge? Where within the agency were we seeing some pushback? Where could we address that? And then we also had the other agencies that worked with us that we had to reach out to who were also under some deadlines to meet some requirements. So we learned to deal with the outside agencies as well as what we had to do within. And I think one of the challenges also that we faced is, as justice, it was reinvestment. And we understood and had tried to train our people and explain about the reinvestment. But one of the challenges also was that they did not see reinvestment within themselves. They saw reinvestment with the offenders, and so there were some cultural issues also that we had to address early on about what we were doing, what the legislation meant, how the reentry would work, or the reinvestment.
People from some states that meet in our national travels, and they say, "Oh, well, the legislation you passed in my state, did the following." And we're not big fans of that. And I then go follow up with folks on our organization and say, why did we do those? I said, we didn't do that. That had nothing to do with the legislation that was passed. Can you talk about any instances that have occurred since the enactment of the legislation and people attributing various policies or thoughts that to that law that actually aren't the case? And then how do you deal with that?
Well, I think originally, we did hear what most of you have heard, hug a thug and catch and release. We heard early release was a big theme in the department because we did allow 6 months prior to the discharge of an inmate who completed his sentence that he would leave 6 months early so that we could supervise them. And so that was an educational piece to explain. It's not like the past where someone completed their sentence and they left the department and we didn't see them again until they returned. As we educated people and went and talked to different groups and explained about supervising people who were going to get out within 6 months and how much smarter that was, that really took some of that sting away. And then we did have some naysayers out in the community who would talk about crime rates were going to go up, and the reason crime rates in Kentucky had fallen is because the offenders were incarcerated. And over time, as the stats came along, that didn't prove to be the case. They continued to make those claims without statistics behind them. And we did the session on gathering statistics and making sure that you measure things, and that's gone a long way for us to be able to say, well, here are the numbers. Here's what's actually happening. So.
Director Wall, you were in a similar situation, I think, right, where people were talking about laws and frustrations with those laws that had absolutely nothing to do with the package that had actually been enacted. How did you help untangle that for people who didn't want that kind of complicated explanation?
We were aware when our particular package of reforms was enacted that it was going to result in people leaving our institutions earlier than would otherwise have been the case. And we all expected that a high noon moment would come at some point. We didn't know that it would happen as quickly as it did. There was one of the most notorious cases of the 20th century in Rhode Island came back to sort of haunt the public. It was somebody who had committed a nauseating crime. And because of the decisions being made between the prosecution and the defense in that case, instead of getting life without parole, he was sentenced to 40 years. Because of the way the time-off sentence laws worked, he actually was being released in 28. And it was as if a hurricane had hit us, because everybody had forgotten about him. He was sentenced under the laws as they were from 1960 until 2008, when our reforms were passed. But everybody made the assumption that it was the Justice Reinvestment reforms in time-off sentence that had resulted in it. And a coalition of prosecutors, some of our union officials, some advocates, came roaring into the legislature with a package to roll it all back. And the coalition held. It was a very difficult time for some of the people who had been involved in some of the leaders in the legislature and in the judiciary and in other places who had been involved with us in passing it. But no one gave way. The coalition held. We got past it.
Any advice? This is going to come up in every state, right? And you've actually have in some ways a longer history with the Justice Reinvestment Package than a lot of other states. So having been through this and knowing that it's going to be inevitable in some other places, any other advice for those kinds of situations to other directors and other state government officials?
It was very helpful that the leaders in the three branches said and acknowledged to one another that they were all taking a risk, that the reason that Rhode Island's population had soared as high as it did was because no one wanted to be the first one to make the move that would lead to the clobbering about who was soft on crime. So they agreed to basically make a pact, and they enforced it. So that they all basically went into the legislature lockstep when those reforms were proposed, and they went back in lockstep when the Woodmansee case erupted. So my advice would be, anticipate that it's going to happen, and be sure that you've got the relationships you need so that everybody realizes if we don't hang together, we'll all hang separately.
So another question for you, if you don't mind, and that is on the money. So much of this is sold on the savings that can be realized. And projections are done, and you talk about the tens or hundreds of millions of dollars that can be saved. And then you find yourself in front of the Appropriations Committee a year or two later, and you're proud to announce that indeed this has had an impact on the prison population, but you actually need more money than you had last year. And so we talk to so many legislators that say, you know, I don't get it. I was told that we were going to spend less, and there the guy is again asking for more money. Walk us through a little bit of that scenario, and I'll be asking some of the other panelists about that scenario as well.
What we did is create some pretty straightforward and easy to understand graphics. So we were all about putting charts up on screens and making it clear that the population, the census really had gone down and gone down dramatically. So our first point was it could have been so much worse than it would have been if you had not enacted these reforms. And the second was that as we go, as is often the case when we're in the legislature, part of our job is to sort of explain correctional math. And correctional math means several things. One of which is, for example, that you can't always make maximum effective use of your bed space. You can have vacant beds and still have costs rising because you can't put awaiting trial inmates in sentence facilities. You can't house men and women together. You've got a protective custody unit. You've got people with mental health issues. So we kind of walk them through all of that to explain why there are vacant beds and we're still asking for more money. That was one. The second, in our case, was we needed to point out that what was really driving the increase was employee wages. We're a very strong union state. The public employee unions are particularly strong, and the public safety public employee unions are sort of at the apex. And we have mandatory collective bargaining, mandatory arbitration on wages. So no control over it by, frankly, either the Corrections Department or the legislature. So that was the second piece. The third was to remind them that before these laws were enacted, the chief legal counsel for the ACLU's National Prison Project, who had sued our department for 20 years in a court case that lasted 2 decades, helpfully stopped by to see how progress was going on justice reinvestment, held a press conference and said, in essence, given the way your census is rising, if the state of Rhode Island doesn't enact these reforms, we're going back into court.
Director Peters, you're going to be in a similar situation in front of the Appropriations Chair. A little bit about how you're thinking of strategy and explaining increased costs even post-reforms.
Well, I'm going to begin using the term correctional math. I'm going to start there. Because it is confusing, right? As exciting as this conversation is, it also is confusing. And I do want to focus on the excitement, because it wasn't just about curbing the cost of growth in corrections. It really was about that justice reinvestment. And I think that's so important. You talked about myths earlier. One of the myths that I think we're still faced with is this whole notion that we're trading justice for money. And that was not it. As the director and also as a commissioner serving with many of my fellow commissioners that are here today on the Commission for Public Safety, one of the things that we said is we would not impact a really great public safety system negatively. And as we're having these appropriations conversations, that's what I continue to focus on, that while we did curb the cost, we were then able to reinvest $57 million back into the community for specialty courts, for victims, evidence-based policing, community corrections, and those things that we know really work. So as we're pushing forward and now wrapping up this biennium's budget and preparing next biennium's budget, it still is complicated trying to figure out, as our projections continue to move, as our population forecast continues to adjust a bit, to figure out what that cost savings, or rather cost avoidance, is going to be in the next biennium is a complicated one. One of the things that we're doing in Oregon this biennium is we're moving those justice reinvestment dollars to the Criminal Justice Commission. So it will actually be out of the Department of Corrections budget and out of our conversation as I sit before the Appropriations Committee. I think that will help with some of the confusion and have that focus just purely be on that reinvestment piece as I manage the population forecast conversation.
Thank you. And as you're pointing out, in part of the correctional math, the way to achieve most of the most significant savings is to actually close prisons. Commissioner Guice, you've seen now 10 prisons close in North Carolina. In talking to officials across the country, I think so many folks who haven't been through that process have been surprised at just how complicated that is. Can you talk through a little bit with the group about the lessons that you've learned from actually having to identify and then close a prison?
I can. I will tell you that I'd like to touch on something that's been said. We're very fortunate in North Carolina in that the projections were that we would, in 5 years, we would save about 30 or have 3,400 less beds in the system, that we would see a savings of $70 million. We actually passed that. We saw a savings of $82 million in 3 years in those 3,400 beds. But part of that is closing facilities, and we closed 10 smaller facilities. That is not easy to do, because you have correctional staff that have invested their entire careers in this work. What we were able to do because of having vacancies that were in facilities that were close by, we were able to put all of those folks to work. So we did not actually lay off anyone that was a CO or a correctional staff person. I will tell you that that's a challenge because you have a RIF process, you have processes that you have to go through to be able to make that happen and make it work. It was committed correctional staff from our HR section that worked closely. A lot of planning went into place in doing that, but also we had to communicate well with the community as we moved forward, because a lot of those correctional facilities were economic engines for some of those small rural communities. So again, while it's a challenge, we've worked hard at ensuring that our message is strong, not just with the community correction, but throughout our correctional system in our facilities. We've worked very hard to have evidence-based programs put in our facilities. We're training and working with our staff on cognitive behavior intervention. A lot of the programs today that are offered in the community we're also offering in the correctional setting, because we are changing how we do business in North Carolina, and we're changing the culture. One thing I would like to say to you that is very important to us is that throughout my entire career, we counted contacts. I was a probation officer, whether it was keeping up with how often someone went to treatment, how many times they applied for jobs, how many times they came into the office, if they were home at night during curfews. We were keeping up with contacts, folks, but today we're doing much more because we have smaller caseloads. When I carried a caseload, it was 120 cases, 130 cases. Today, those caseloads are at 60 because of Justice Reinvestment. We had that infusion of reinvestment money to get those caseloads down. We're able to spend time sitting knee to knee and being able to use the nuances of today, the tools available to us to have those meaningful conversations that truly make a difference in the lives of folks. What I've learned is this: if you do not address the underlying issue, you will never correct and change the behavior. I'm sorry.
That's all right. So, Commissioner, many folks here dealing with situations in their states where the legislator who championed a lot of those reforms termed out, retired, maybe lost his or her seat, change in governors. You've been through a lot of that in North Carolina. What advice would you have for folks who are trying to make sure that the political leadership, that Director Wall talked about, that sustained commitment to this, is still there when you have those change in leaders? What kinds of strategies can keep those people involved? And if you could, maybe just talk a little bit about some of the hearings that were held just last week.
Well, it's important to note that some of the folks that were leading those hearings, the co-chairs of the committees, the Oversight Committee, are here with us today from North Carolina. And also a senator that had worked with us early in this process. They're all champions of this process. We've worked hard to continue to build that relationship and keep that relationship with these folks. I tell my staff, regardless if I'm in the field talking to someone or if I'm at the legislature, I emphasize that we're still plowing the ground. The work is still out there for us to do. We'll have to continue to train daily. And you know, if you've ever planted potatoes, and if you've ever turned that plow a certain way to get those potatoes out of the ground, I, as a youngster, went behind that tractor, my grandfather's tractor, and I picked those potatoes up because I thought that that was fun to do. But you know, occasionally I didn't get a potato, I got a big rock. Well, we find that true in our work today, guys. And we have to continue to keep plowing the ground and doing this great work. The preparation is upon us as leaders to prepare community leaders, prepare your staff to take these roles and responsibilities. And we just develop good folks within the organization, but also I think I saw it at the best the other day. The Director of Community Correction had invited 50 of her staff to this oversight committee meeting. They had never been in the legislature probably before and never sat in a meeting. And when the chair of that meeting, Representative Bowles, asked if any of those folks, he recognized them and asked if they would like to come up to the mic and speak. 4 people walked to that mic. One of them's here today. And when he walked to that mic, they talked about different pieces of justice reinvestment. Couldn't have choreographed it any better. That's preparation. We're preparing people that have bought into this changing of culture of how we do business in North Carolina.
I think it's a wonderful example of people who are been working in these areas for so many years and are so used to the only times they're in the legislature or in a high-level state agency is to really get taken to the woodshed. Now to have an opportunity to actually talk about some positive accomplishments, and Director Peters and Commissioner Thompson on your end, other kinds of strategies that you can think about to really get the frontline staff invested in this new approach to justice in your state, some strategies that you would recommend.
I think getting those frontline staff members engaged is key to this conversation. There's no doubt about it. As was mentioned earlier, that's where it all happens, right? It's all of those contacts and all of that involvement. I think the conversation for us with our frontline staff really has evolved around outcomes and really looking at the research and data to help us make those good policy decisions. We've been fortunate in Oregon in that for years now, we've had legislation that's required us to engage in evidence-based practices. And so that is something that we already had that base of support for our staff. And so really looking at the future and looking at the fact that we don't really know how much these changes are going to impact our system. And when you talk about collaboration with our stakeholders, I think that's the thing that I'm able to share most with staff, that we are now seeing a collaboration with the sheriffs, the chiefs, the district attorneys, the judiciary, the legislature that we've never seen before around public safety, and really helping our staff see the value in those relationships and those conversations. Because much like was spoken about earlier, as we prepared our budget last time around for our work following the Commission on Public Safety, we had so many stakeholders come forward in support of our budget. That had never happened before. We had always been this black hole of funding in the state, right? Nobody wants to spend money in corrections, but they want us to keep them all behind the gates. And so I think that collaboration really has freed up our staff to have more of an engagement and feel more empowered to play that role in public safety.
Interesting. So, we keep talking about this Justice Reinvestment. The Assistant Attorney General underscored it in her remarks earlier today, not as being a one-time bill or a particular policy, but really a real culture change in the way people approach these justice issues. Commissioner Thompson, anything to add just in terms of getting those staff really invested and involved?
I think I have a little bit different experience too from the panel. Most of you know I started as a correctional officer. I grew up through the system, and when I came back to the staff, like David said, we were able to change our caseload for probation and parole because we had some monies there to add staff. But what wasn't seen is we also added a lot of duties. So even though we were able to change the caseload, the number of people that the staff saw, they also got a lot of extra duties that they had to work through. And that was true also in the institutions. Plus, we spent so much time about how security works with the offender. And that's been a big change, especially for the security staff behind the fence, that, they had one set of responsibilities that they had in the past, and now we're asking them to do some things they've never had to do before. So there is a culture change. And in Kentucky, unfortunately, our staff are some of the lowest paid in the nation. So my turnover rate is great. So as you talked about, Colette, we're constantly retraining. And to be able to see, when I went to the last time, I also had to ask for monies because we had cost avoidance. And I didn't think I would ever be glad to have to go ask for $15 million, but I'd previously asked for $25 million and $23 million. So we are seeing a change, and the staff is learning that, less number of inmates and the opportunity to work with fewer people is making a change in the institutions. And also those people in the field are learning how to use the tools on the front end. We did give them more duties, but what happened is as we find these gaps of where we need to address the needs of the inmates, that is lessening their load later in the day. So they've learned, I think, really a lot from just actually putting it in place. But the front end conversations were a little bit tough, I think, in the beginning as a challenge.
Commissioner Guice, when you talk about really re-educating a whole workforce, not just in corrections, but in the courts and in prosecutors, defense attorneys, all with kinds of questions about the implications of the new law that was passed. You did something that was really interesting. You engaged the state university system to write pamphlets and run some trainings. Can you talk a little bit about what UNC's been doing?
Well, I can. I wished I could talk about NC State, but you didn't ask me that question. No, I will tell you that we've got a great university system, and Jamie Markham and the group that works with us so much on criminal justice issues in North Carolina, and his assistance and help of the training of our district attorneys, our probation staff, our judges about this great piece of legislation was just unreal. Jamie, raise your hand. He's sitting right here in front. Just does great work for us, and we're so proud of him. And he wrote a book about justice reinvestment in North Carolina, and been able to put out a lot of good information, slick papers that have been able to help the courts to understand things. And we call them cheat sheets, but I don't think he wants me to use that term. But he's done a great deal of work. And then, of course, there's been a great deal of work with our Community Corrections Director, Ann Presythe, and the UNC itself. And they have assisted us in remarkable ways at preparing our staff and getting information out to our programs people. We've got some great program staff that have come together to help us be effective and efficient in getting information out. So we really couldn't have done this without the community itself. We've been very fortunate.
Director Wall, as you mentioned, I think you enacted the reforms in 2008, was it?
Yes.
So several years ago, you saw the prison population decline, much as you would forecast. You've seen recidivism decline. You've seen crime go down in the state. So all trends headed in the right directions. And then most recently, we've looking at prison population projections in your state, and the numbers are creeping up again. A little bit about the situation you find yourself in, and what do you think is next?
It is true that the numbers are starting to creep up again. The good news is that we are still hundreds lower than we would have been, and that in addition, recidivism is down from what it used to be as well. We're analyzing the drivers, as we were taught to do through justice reinvestment, of our increase in population. And it's leading us to look closely at probation and parole. We have a low rate of incarceration compared to most states in the nation. We are in the top 3 or 4 in the nation for overall correctional control, meaning that prison sentences are traded off against very long post-release supervision terms. And the effect of that, of course, is that at some point during the ensuing 20 years, somebody may do something that causes their probation to be violated. So I'm glad that we were invited to this forum, because we, having been a relatively early state in justice reinvestment and having sort of addressed what was going on in the institutional population, are now, I think, taking a more sophisticated look and realizing that what's going on in probation and parole, sentencing and supervision, is also possibly driving this institutional population up again. So we may be looking to see if we can participate in a round 2 of justice reinvestment.
Great, thank you. We're going to wrap up in just a minute. I'm going to ask for a final speed round here, if we could. I'll ask one question, and maybe you can each answer it in under a minute if possible. And that is, each of your states has had a really successful experience with justice reinvestment legislation, and then in translating that in everyday policy and practice. You're brought in as a consultant to another state that's just been asked, that's just enacted legislation. Based on the experiences that you've had, what do you think is critically important for people in corrections, community corrections? You have all those people gathered in a room. What's the message you really want to underscore to them as they are still basking in the glow of the passage of this, but now realizing kind of sort of there's some hard work ahead? Commissioner?
I would say Kentucky is very fortunate because the team that was in place legislatively and the judicial team and the executive team, they were very good about going out, making sure the stakeholders were involved in the beginning. So we had a little head start there. I think the challenge is to make sure that it gets a little further down into the weeds, because when we started, we thought everybody really did understand how it worked, and quickly found out that wasn't quite the way the further you get away from Frankfort. But I would say to make sure you do include those stakeholders. You know, we did have a lot of great input and buy-in from all the staff. And just to be able to make sure that that word gets out. I've heard from some of the other states where that didn't happen. They weren't as fortunate as we were. And just listening to those challenges they've had where those conversations and that inclusiveness was not there created a problem.
Director Peters?
I would say keep the communication going. Just do not stop the communication with your stakeholders. We created regional implementation councils across the state that allow us to have that conversation on the ground with our stakeholders, and really allowing the local DAs, sheriffs, chiefs to actually look at the data. Who are they sending to us and for how long? And I think it's that communication that's keeping the conversation live. I think it's moving that culture for us away from this whole notion that I'm a limitless resource and there's not a connection to the on-the-ground law enforcement and who they're sending to us. And I think that will help us continue to push this conversation forward and really make a culture shift and not let this be a flash in the pan that goes away.
Thanks. Commissioner Guice?
Well, I think, as I've said earlier, I think one of the keys will be to designate someone, a person, a position, to help lead that effort and implementation. I think that's going to be critical. The relationship with the stakeholders is extremely important, so you want to keep that alive and going and work through processes, understanding that we can tweak things if we need to tweak things. You don't have to be locked in and believe that you can't make some adjustment, even to legislation. If you ask a group of legislators, they'll tell you it's quite easy. They tweak the law all the time. So you could do it. And we've already tweaked our justice reinvestment piece, and we'll probably look at tweaking it again and again. But also I would say to you that you've got to bring together those leaders within your department that do the work on a daily basis, and get them engaged and involved in that process. So I would encourage you in that area. But lastly, I would say this. There's others of us out here that have already began that process, implemented this legislation, seen some success. We're willing to come and assist and help you. Always remember that. It was nice to be able to call CSG. It was nice for them to be able to call Texas and send someone from Texas down to see us, or one of the other states. So it's exciting, but you've got some assistance and help out there.
Thank you. Director Wall?
My comments will echo what my colleagues have said. In Rhode Island, I think there was a great sense of pride on the part of the leaders in the criminal justice system and those staff who worked with them on getting this initiative accomplished. And that pride has led to collateral benefits in relationships that, and I would say, continue to nurture those relationships among the people who were involved in the initial work. And I also agree that there's no reason not to continue to do what you're doing here, which is in essence kind of bringing us all back and sort of letting us celebrate with one another and share our experiences with one another. Peer-to-peer exchanges, I think, are very powerful.
Great. Before I turn it back over to Jake Horowitz to lead us into the next segment, please join me in thanking this terrific panel.